Beautiful. Any day. Good old technology. I hate the loading bar. It's so frustrating. It's funny, we've never had, I guess we never had technology before and we didn't mind waiting, and now it's just you're so impatient for even the slightest.
Yep.
Alrighty, Mum, could you just give me a quick check, please, if it's all up and ready on there? I've got to refresh. So you go to, that's on your page, so you've got to go to the
Secret burden.
Yep. And go to, yep, awesome. We are on. Yay. Oh, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for spending your time with me in the afternoon today, and everyone out there. I really appreciate your time today because I know you're super busy. So thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks. So before we kick start into, I ask you some questions, because today we're talking about eating disorders. So everything to do with diagnosis, recovery, treatment, effects, all the rest. We'll cover that all for you guys out there. And so, yeah, before we kick it off and get into the nitty gritty stuff, do you want to give us a little brief overview, Sarah, on who you are?
Sure. So my name is Sarah King. You can follow me online pretty much everywhere at Sarah Liz King. My personal story is I am an eating disorder survivor as well. I recovered from anorexia nervosa many years ago now, and also suffered from hypothalamic amenorrhea. So I lost my period for a really long time due to stress and over-exercising, and still kind of under-fueling myself even when I had recovered. So that's kind of my own personal history, and it made me so interested when I became an allied health professional to help others that had disordered eating or eating disorders or hormonal issues that I had also experienced find their way back to health and happiness through a really balanced lifestyle instead of what we're being fed as mostly diet culture. So in my professional life, I am an exercise physiologist and a health coach, and I mainly help women, like I said before, recover their periods and have a better relationship with food, exercise, and their body.
Wow, brilliant sum up. That was magnificent, rehearsed. So I want to kick off starting with eating disorders. So some people out there may have not a clue what an eating disorder is. So what is an eating disorder?
So an eating disorder is a mental health issue with many physical complications, symptoms, and side effects. But first and foremost, it is a mental health issue. So it is classified in the DSM-5 along with other mental health issues like depression and anxiety. And you can, if you suffer from some of these symptoms, then you can be diagnosed with an eating disorder. And the main types are binge eating, bulimia, anorexia nervosa. But the biggest one that most people suffer from is binge eating, despite the fact that we see, anorexia probably more in the media than other eating disorders.
Okay. And what are some of the symptoms of the three eating disorders that you talked of?
Yeah. So even though they are separate diagnoses, I kind of like the trans diagnostic model, which assumes that even though these different eating disorders have different symptoms, kind of the main thing that makes them all quite common is this over-evaluation of weight and shape, and that being the root cause and the driver of the different behaviors. So anorexia nervosa is classified by restriction of food, being underweight potentially, but then there is a subtype where you do not have to be underweight to be restrictive. It's that fear of food and the anxiousness that comes along with it. Binge eating is basically that objective overconsumption of food where a person feels out of control, and it happens on a really regular basis, and they don't feel like it's something that they can control. Bulimia is a binge and purge cycle, and that can be through vomiting, it can be through laxative abuse, it can also be through over exercising as well.
Okay. Wow. And so how does someone know that they have an eating disorder?
So, eating disorders and disordered eating run on a spectrum. And the intensity with which someone feels those symptoms can really range from quite mild to having like some hang-ups around food or their body, or maybe they've overeaten occasionally, to those symptoms feeling so intense that they take up the majority of someone's headspace. And that's really when it kind of goes into the more clinical side of having an eating disorder. But anyone on this spectrum, even if you only have a few little hangups, those can sometimes be very invasive for some people. So even if you are someone that only believes you have a few hangups around food or exercise or your body, or you know it's a real issue for you, I think the biggest thing that we need to tell people is that you deserve to get help, and seeking help when you feel like it's not such a big issue and something that you could potentially quote unquote like nip in the bud is probably the best way to go before it spirals into something that could be clinically an eating disorder.
Yeah. How do you know, though, I guess in this current culture that we're living in, where we're told to go on these diets and to be thin, how do you know when it's just too much and that it's looking towards disordered eating?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is if it's taking over areas of your life that you once really valued. So relationships suffer in terms of your work or your studying. You'd much rather make time to go to the gym or make sure you have time to make the perfect food than you would be in a social situation. Basically, it becomes the only thing that is front of mind for someone. And so that's when it becomes problematic. There is a fine line between dedication and disordered. And because of diet culture, it makes what can look, one can be often disguised as the other. So I think the main thing that is the deciding factor for people is like, if you are just someone that's quite dedicated, then you probably wouldn't have so many hangups if you had to skip a day. Or you could probably be more flexible in a social situation if you had to, and it wouldn't cause you that same mental anxiety and stress as it would someone that had an eating disorder.
Yeah.
So I think often if you ask someone, like, if you had to not go without doing these things, how would you feel? And that can really be the defining factor as to whether it's someone that's really suffering from an eating disorder or someone that is just, quite into looking after themselves. Because there are people who have, very dedicated lifestyles, for lack of a better word. But if work gets in the way or a family member is sick and they need to take care of them, they're very, very able to relax and do those things.
Oh, good way to put it. um, I guess so when people realize that they are developing symptoms or a couple of things that you've mentioned, they're like, oh, yeah, that's me. Where do they go first? Because, yes, there is a lot of people that don't understand the illness. So sometimes with going to family members, who should you seek first?
Yeah. So your best point of contact is always your primary healthcare practitioner. So your general healthcare practitioner, your GP, they're usually the first person that you should speak to, because they're basically the connector for you to get additional services. The other places that you can go if you find that you aren't really sure where to start are the Butterfly Foundation, who have a whole bunch of resources on their website. And that is an Australian founded eating disorder charity. There's also NEDA, which is the National Eating Disorder Association, which is in America. Again, another website with loads of information. And then lastly, there in Australia is something called the Inside Out Institute, which is a center that researches eating disorders and is at the front line of making some really interesting developments. So on their website, you can also find a range of different practitioners in your area that specialize in eating disorder and eating disorder recovery. So psychologists, psychiatrists, dietitians, all the rest of them are all in there and listed for you.
Yeah. I guess that it is such a big step for someone to admit that they're suffering from any illness. What tips or what advice would you give to someone that's at that stage, just going, yeah, but there's so many factors in that: money, I've got to put time into myself. How do you get over that barrier?
I think I wish there was an easy way to get over that barrier. I wish there was some way that we could make it easier. Sometimes you just have to go in scared. Sometimes you just have to do it afraid. And oftentimes that is the best way to just get started, is to realize it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. You're going to feel a bit stuck. It's going to feel really new because you are basically stepping into a bit of the unknown. I think the beautiful thing that we have now, like you mentioned before, it is an investment. It is an investment, yes. But the fact that Medicare now supports people seeking treatment, so up to 40 psychology visits a year and up to 20 dietetic or other allied health professional visits, is a big step in the right direction. But I think, a lot of times it's just having, I think that the best analogy that I can give is if you broke your leg, you would very much just, go to the hospital, go and get it checked, and you would be on the road to recovery. But whenever it comes to something that we can't see, we are much less likely to, seek treatment. But an eating disorder or any mental health issue deserves just as much care and attention and support as someone that has broken their leg.
Yeah. Wow. Do you also think that if we look at anorexia now as our next point of discussion, what are the physical effects on someone if they're diagnosed with anorexia?
Physical effects can really range for someone, but it affects your whole entire body. So I think the physical health complications are things like electrolyte imbalances from insufficient nutrition. Then you also have muscle wastage and just generally being underweight. There are hormonal changes that happen. So if someone is in a state where they are restricting their energy intake and their calories and their body percentage falls too low, then their sex hormones drop. It affects your heart. So your heart is a muscle. And if you starve the heart, then there are problems with that as well. So irregularities in terms of your heartbeat, really, really low blood pressure. So, being careful with getting up from a lying or a seated position, because if you have low blood pressure, you will be more prone to fainting. And then, of course, there is the psychological side effects. So people are much more prone to depression and anxiety and social anxiety. There is basically a strong psychological drive to do things. So those can be physical things, and kind of that is basically your body's drive to, if you were in the wild, go and get food. But for many people, it feels like a real difficulty sitting still. Cool. Are you there, Ashley? Sorry, guys. I don't know where Ashley's gone. She'll be back. Okay, she's text messaging me with the next question. Sorry, guys. We'll get there in a second. Okay. So physical and mental side effects for binge eating. Let's go through that one. So binge eating is basically eating a high volume of food in a very short period of time. So the person that is experiencing this often feels out of control around food and that they don't have any sense of being able to stop themselves while they're in the binge. So the amount of food eaten can be very, very subjective from person to person, but it would be more than any person could typically eat, but in a very, very short period of time. So, what are the physical kind of complications of this? Well, it can really mess with your hunger and fullness cues. Depending on the frequency of binging, it can lead to an increase in weight. It can also cause extreme feelings of guilt and shame and hopelessness. And I think those are really the main ones that people struggle with. Physically, if the person is just suffering from binge eating, it can also lead to things mentally like secrecy and isolation, which most eating disorders thrive in. And if it goes untreated, the person can also have the physical health complications that may be aligned with metabolic disease. So, an increased risk of heart disease and diabetes, which comes from being over their body's ideal weight. So those are the main ones. Psychologically, it has similar impacts to any other eating disorder or mental health issue where there is a lot of thought and rumination about food. There's a lot of guilt and shame wrapped up in that as well. And sorry, I'm just getting the next question from Ashley, which will be on bulimia. So those are the main ones for binge eating. And I think one of the reasons why people struggle so much with binge eating is that oftentimes after a binge, people go straight into restriction. And then that sets them up physiologically in that restriction to then binge again. So that mindset thing of really, really breaking that binge restrict cycle is really, really important. The next one is bulimia. So we're going to talk about the physical and mental health kind of complications and impacts from bulimia. So like I said before, bulimia has that binge purge cycle within it. So similar to binge eating, there is that same symptom of eating a large amount of food in a really, really short period of time. The difference between binge eating and bulimia is the compensation. So after that large amount of food is eaten, there is some form of compensation taken. So this can be anything from purging, so vomiting, can be laxative abuse as well, or over-exercise. So anything that tries to rid the body of the food or the calories consumed. Now, depending on the type of purging that the person does can really lead to different physical health complications. Oh, I think she's back. Hello. I can't quite hear you yet. I think you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh,
yes.
Hallelujah. So sorry, the beautiful internet of the tweet. Okay, so I'm now on a really small phone. So what did
That's
we get?
Okay. I did binge eating, and I'm talking about like the mental and physical complications of bulimia. So I was just saying that depending on the different or the type of purging that someone engages in will depend on some of the physical health complications that are associated. So purging in terms of vomiting, you can have electrolyte imbalances. You also wear away the lining of your stomach and your esophagus, so you're more likely to have some gastric issues, some esophageal issues, an increased rate risk of ulcers and stomach cancer, as well as problems with the enamel on your teeth. In terms of laxative abuse, again, you can really ruin your body's biofeedback mechanism in terms of being able to go comfortably to the toilet without any laxatives, because your body has become dependent on them. And it can also, again, lead to that electrolyte imbalances, because you're basically flushing out a whole bunch of electrolytes along with the other matter that's in your colon. And then over exercising, if you're using that as a form of purging, if you are someone that doesn't rehydrate yourself properly, again, electrolyte imbalances, which you don't think too much of, but that can also lead to arrhythmias, fainting, all the rest of it. It's really, really problematic. And then you can, lead to increased risk of stress fractures or stress injuries if you're not giving your body enough time to recover and properly refuel and rehydrate between the exercise that you're doing.
Wow. So it sounds like there's so many effects from these disorders, yet why do you think that the media and the diet culture is encouraging, being thin and losing weight and restricting your eating so much when there's so many health, like bad things to impact your health?
Well, I think it's important to note that the diet industry is an industry like any other that's trying to make money. And the way that it's trying to make money is it feeds off of people's insecurities. The only way that it can feed off of people's insecurities is if it makes people think that there is something fundamentally wrong with them to begin with. And that's what diet culture essentially does, because we know there's nothing inherently wrong with eating better. There's nothing inherently wrong with exercise. There's even nothing inherently wrong with wanting to lose weight. It's just that the way that we're told that we have to go about doing this can be quite radical. It can be not grounded in science. And I think that's where people often go wrong. But it's important to know that, diet culture is like any other industry, and it's just trying to make money, and it's been around for a long time, and it's not really about to go anywhere. So yes, we can get angry at it, but I think what's even better is to just be a very, very wary consumer and know what is diet culture, because it can be very, very sneaky.
Yeah. Now, we're talking a lot about the body. I know that the diet culture does have an impact for a lot of people with eating disorders on their body. How can you rebuild that relationship with your body when you fundamentally lose it?
Yeah, that's one that takes really the longest period of time. And body image is one of the critical factors in someone sustaining recovery from an eating disorder. And oftentimes it doesn't take very long for our bodies to physically restore, but it takes a really long time for our brain to catch up. And this is because I like to describe it as there's oftentimes a soundtrack that goes on in our head when we've been fed one message. And if that message has predominantly been lose weight, you're not acceptable in society if you aren't meeting a certain size or eating a certain way, then that soundtrack can be really, really loud. It's not just the case of like going and grabbing another record and putting it on and happy days. You basically have to unlearn that song that played in your head for a really long time. And it's going to come on sometimes, like it'll pop on the radio and you'll be like, oh, I don't want to hear this. I don't want this to be around, but it's there. And so you have to become aware of it. And then you have to challenge all the things that you're thinking, all the while trying to write a new song that becomes the predominant one that plays in your head. And that's kind of what body image is. It's rebuilding that relationship with yourself, that new song. And it takes a lot of effort. And it takes a huge amount of effort, predominantly because we are still surrounded by that messaging that, exercise is only for weight loss and eating healthily is only so that you can live in a small body. And that's not the case at all. So rebuilding your body image and your relationship with yourself is really about calling out all those things on the broken record in your head and saying to yourself, are those actually true? Where did I learn those? If they're not true, what are, 2 or 3 other things that I could think of that are different and a more kind way to approach that certain topic?
Yeah. And how do you rebuild that relationship with food? Because most of these disorders are about food.
Yeah. So I think it's another slow process as well. And intuitive eating, or some of the concepts of intuitive eating, can be really, really helpful here. One of the biggest ones is food morality. So the essence that one food is good and another is inherently bad. And the only reason that we've kind of gained that kind of relationship is because we learned it somewhere. When we were born, we didn't know the difference between apples and apple pie. Just knew that one tasted sweeter and had a crust, and the other one had a red skin that we had to bite into. Somewhere along the way, someone once told us that one food is bad or another one is better, and those messages became ingrained. So like anything, the only way to rebuild your relationship with food is to practice a new one. So it's going, what am I really afraid of? What are my fear foods? What are the food rules that I have? Where did I learn these? And like literally challenging them one at a time to build up evidence, like a scientist would, that that hypothesis you have in your head isn't really true. Like, I can eat a chocolate bar and the world still keeps turning. Or I can eat 2 types of carbohydrates at dinner. Like, I can have potato in my curry and I can have that curry with rice. And again, nothing bad happens and it's actually quite tasty. So it's doing all these little mini challenges, and it's actually in the doing that the confidence comes, that the realizations come, that the new form of thinking comes. But you can't rewire your brain without doing the behaviors as well.
Do you think that it's necessary going through recovery to actually eliminate the negative, I guess, feedback and content that you're consuming, including from just say a friend that might be saying certain things about your body and what you're eating?
Yeah, I mean, as much as you can, I think, be aware of what your triggers are, but also know that you can't control all of your triggers. And there will be times in your life that you will be around people that talk about dieting or weight or whatever it is. So I think almost creating a bit of a buffer and a shield for yourself in a way can be a good way to handle that. So just telling yourself, like, my body doesn't thrive based on what other people are doing to theirs, can be a really, really good one. If someone chooses to diet, that's their own prerogative, but it doesn't mean that's what I need to do to mine. I think a big one for me personally, I always assumed that all health advice was for me, and it's not. All health advice is contextual. So it really depends on who the person is and what they're dealing with. Like, you wouldn't give someone the same nutrition advice who was generally healthy, or even someone who might be slightly underweight. You wouldn't give them the same nutrition advice as you would someone suffering from diabetes.
Yeah.
So as much as you can, I think, limit the sources of negativity, the amount of social media you consume. Notice how you feel when you're around certain friends as well.
Yeah.
And spend more time with the people and in the places that actually make you feel good and comfortable about yourself.
Yeah. Now, I think I've done a bit of research and obviously going through my recovery as well. There's so much about this quasi recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please just give us a little bit of a definition of what is quasi recovery and what is an example of it?
Yeah. So quasi recovery is like this black hole that people get sucked into, and it feels like infinity, and like you could go and stay in there forever. But essentially, quasi recovery is getting to this stage where things aren't so bad. You're definitely not as unwell as you once were, physically or mentally. I think it's important to actually state that. But in your heart of hearts, you're not 100% where you need to be. So quasi recovery can sometimes look like regaining some weight, but not regaining to a full amount. So you're no longer physiologically compromised, but you're not at a healthy weight either. It can be including foods that you previously didn't used to, but still having certain rules. Maybe it's about timing or the frequency with which you're allowed to have those things. It could also look in terms of exercise. So maybe cutting down the amount of exercise that you did or swapping the type that you did, but changing one obsession for another. So someone says, I've stopped running, I don't run anymore, but now I just do bar classes every day, but that's fine. Or I do Pilates classes, or I do yoga every day, but still having that real anxiousness about what happens if they weren't able to exercise. So it's essentially addressing some issues, but just staying in this middle ground where things feel still safe. So you're 1 foot into your eating disorder and 1 foot out. And it's a really sticky situation to be in because it's really where you can make or break your recovery. You can really push forward and reach that full recovery. Or if something happens, it's really easy to slide backwards as well. The alternative is people just hum along there for years. And that is a bit of denial, because I think we've all been stuck there at some point, myself included. And you just tell yourself stories that you know really aren't factual, just to not have to do the work.
Yeah. Why do you think people with eating disorders get stuck in that quasi recovery?
Look, I can't speak for everyone, and I think the reasons will be very, very different depending on the person. But I think one of the biggest reasons is that recovery is exhausting. Mentally, it's exhausting. Physically, it's exhausting. And people get to a point where they just want to break. And I think there's a big difference between pressing pause in recovery and getting stuck in quasi recovery. You can press pause. Pausing looks like making sure you still maintain your full meal plan, making sure that you are still going to see your psychologist. And that can help you just regain your energy. But pausing is very, very different. Pausing has the intention of moving forward again, whereas people who decide to get stuck just go, it's all too hard, it's all too much, which I can understand. It is very, very, very tiring. But the thing to remember is it won't always feel like that. And you can stay in quasi recovery. It's a choice. But if you just push through that little barrier and even do 1 or 2 challenging things a week, progress is progress. It doesn't matter how small or how slow. Don't need to compare yourself to others, but you just need to make sure that you're not sitting idly by, because that is time, when you have freedom from your eating disorder. And I think people who reach recovery can really experience this. Your headspace is so free to be able to pursue your passions and really engage with life again. And in quasi recovery, that's not really the case. And I think that's what makes my heart break for people that get stuck there, is because they've seen that life can be better, but they don't know how life good can be yet.
Yeah. Wow. And how, for someone that's on the outside looking in that has no idea or hadn't had an experience with someone with an eating disorder or themselves, when you say that it's an exhausting recovery process, what do you mean by that?
What's a good way to explain this? I was like, I don't think it's like saying, like, to someone that's never like gone through childbirth, like, how do you explain how painful that situation is? Probably not the same.
Yeah.
But imagine you are terrified of spiders, and 6 times a day someone forced you to sit in a room where spiders crawl all over you. That's sometimes how it feels every time a person with an eating disorder has to challenge a food rule, or eat when they don't want to, or sit with the uncomfortable urges of wanting to binge, or any of those feelings. It is legitimately facing a fear multiple times a day, where their rational brain can tell them that nothing bad is going to happen, but they still feel these intense feelings of anxiousness and guilt and the urges. They're all there. That's why it's mentally exhausting. It can also be physically exhausting. So having to prepare more meals, having to think about the next meal, it just goes on and on. And I think that's why it's tiring. And even if you have the best support network, it can be really, really exhausting. Now, on the flip side, it can also be really invigorating, can be really, really empowering at the same time as being really tiring. But sometimes from the outside looking in, because, you know, someone with an eating disorder might put on a really, really brave face, they're never really 100%, they never really will fully understand what it's actually like.
Yeah. Do you think it's critical for someone with an eating disorder to have a support network?
100%.
Yeah.
I don't think that this is something anyone can get through on their own. And if they have, I think you are incredible.
Yeah.
But I always think that we need someone that is objective, who can call us out on our own BS, and who can give us the gentle nudge forward, and also know when we might need that rest. I think that's really important too.
And who would be involved in a support network generally?
So first and foremost, you need to have regular contact with your GP. They're usually your good point of contact. Seeing a psychologist, as they're really the ones that will give you the tools for cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is first line treatment for most people with an eating disorder. There are other forms of treatment that your psychologist might do. So things like DBT or ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, which is great for anxiety. But having a psychologist or a psychiatrist on board can be really, really helpful, because sometimes medication is really also quite helpful in terms of managing mood or other symptoms that a person might be experiencing.
Yeah.
The other ones that can be really, really helpful are to have a dietitian on board. So someone to give you guidance about what is a suitable meal plan, meal structure, food intake for you, and give you tools on how to manage things like urges around binge eating, how to get through restrictive periods, how to overcome certain food rules, and challenge things around the things that you're scared of as well. On top of that, it's really good to have good family and support, good family and friend support. So eating disorders thrive in isolation, they thrive in secrecy. So actually telling people what you're struggling with can really help them hold you accountable to getting better as well. I could keep going. I think that the other thing would be having a mentor. So having someone that has recovered themselves, or someone like myself who's like a health and recovery coach who has been there as well and can really just give you tools and help you with the accountability that you need to really execute those behaviors day to day.
Yeah. And how can someone, like a friend or a family member, support someone with an eating disorder? Because I know there's a lot of people that have a yes, do this, no, do this. How can they best support someone?
I think the biggest thing, and one of the questions that's often overlooked, is to ask the person in front of you how they would like to be supported. Because everyone is going to be so different. I think if you come at support in a really non-judgmental way and treat the person not like a disease, but someone that is actually a human being who's really trying their best most of the time. I think a lot of the time, the people that we are closest to, the eating disorder, will often try and distance the most. So any support person out there, I think, needs to be reminded that sometimes yelling, screaming, tantrums aren't actually your loved one, but the eating disorder really acting out and trying to distance and get you to stop them from becoming a smaller part of that person's life. So yeah, ask the person how they want to be supported. Be mindful with language, and also watch how you are as a support person around food and exercise, and be really, really, really honest with yourself if you do have any hangups around that, and make sure you address them, because a person with an eating disorder will pick up on those really, really quickly.
Yeah. And how does a person with an eating disorder deal with the judgment that I think does come with an eating disorder? I guess when people comment on what you're eating, how much you're eating once they're aware of your eating disorder.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest bit, is people become overly focused on like, what are the foods that you're eating? Are you allowed to have a salad? Like,
Yeah.
why are you having 2 desserts a day? Like, they'll just question everything. It is one of those times where you have to put your blinders on again and literally just tell people in a very gentle, kind way to F off.
Yeah.
That you just go like, I don't know, food is just food. This is just what I need to thrive. And I think, what your body needs to thrive will be very, very different. Sometimes the hardest thing that people have in terms of weight gain, if they've been in a period of restriction, is eating more than the rest of their peers might be eating, or the rest of their family might be eating, or even their partner who may be of the opposite sex. And there is a stereotype that women should just eat small amounts and be dainty all the time. But that is not true. The female body and the human body needs a lot of energy to thrive. And if you've been in a period of deprivation for a really long period of time, you're not just rebuilding structural components like the muscle that you might have lost. You're also rebuilding muscle around your organs, essential fat around your organs, all of these little things that are going on in the background that you have no idea, which take a lot of energy and can also make someone feel very, very fatigued before they start feeling more energized.
Yeah. Wow. It's crazy how you don't really think about all the internal stuff that's going on, how much energy that actually needs.
Yeah.
How does someone deal with the weight gain?
This is my favorite question. Weight gain can be really, really tough. And I think some of the most difficult comments that people get are like, oh, I wish I had that problem. Like, I wish I was eating all this food. And you're just like, please don't say that.
Yeah.
Weight gain happens usually a lot slower than people anticipate. And the feeling of fullness is often what is one of the biggest struggles for people. That is because when you have been undernourished for a really long period of time, you have slow gastric emptying. That basically means that food leaves your stomach at a much slower pace and is digested at a much slower pace than someone who's never gone through an eating disorder or a long period of restriction. That means you can get full on a really small amount of food and feel quite nauseous. And there's other symptoms that people experience, like bloating and digestive issues as well. Now, most people would go into that thinking like, if this is happening, it means I need to eat less. However, the only way that you fix that situation is by continually fueling your body with frequent meals and knowing that it is a short-term problem that will be easily fixed if your body gets to a very well-nourished state. I think empowering yourself with that education can be really, really helpful as well, because when you're in it, it can feel all-consuming. When you are someone that's used to feeling empty, having less food in your system, you'll become more aware of how your body feels. So when you're going through this process of adding more food into your diet, it's really good to have other tools in your toolbox to deal with those feelings of overwhelm and being more aware of your body. So that can be grounding techniques or distraction or things that kind of add to your self-care. Those can all really help as you go through that weight gain process. Do you want to talk about weight distribution as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I think the other thing that people struggle with is sometimes weight doesn't distribute evenly initially. So if you've been in a very undernourished state for a long period of time, sometimes there is more accumulation around your midsection in terms of weight gain. Now, this is your body's very, very, very smart way of going like, oh, we were hungry for a while. We're going to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So it'll just give you some extra fuel storage around your midsection to protect your organs, to make sure that you have sufficient nutrition if you go into a period where there may be less food available, i.e. restriction. However, your recovery body is not the body that you will have forever. So weight redistribution typically happens between 12 and 18 months after full weight restoration. And that can be the hardest thing, to just know that your body shape may change, but in the short term may be slightly different. So to just make sure you honor your body by having clothes that make you feel comfortable and flattered. And sometimes that means not having things that are, as clingy. I know for myself, it was more having those like nice loose tops for a while that just made me feel like I could be in my body comfortably and take care of it and nourish it. And then yes, over time, weight redistribution does occur.
Yeah. I want to now talk about the menstrual cycle,
Yes.
because I think it is such an important factor and can affect a lot of people with eating disorders.
Sure.
So why is the period so important for females, and why may we lose it?
So your menstrual cycle is like your fifth vital sign. So it basically tells you that your body is in a happy, healthy, and functioning state. It consists of two phases, so your follicular phase and your luteal phase, where your body goes through a flow of low hormones to high hormones and then having a period. So the reason why it's so important is because estrogen in particular is protective of your bones. And without it, females tend to lose a lot of their bone mass. So it's estimated that for every year a female is without a period, she can lose 2% or more of her bone mass, which is huge. It's a really big thing. Previously, it was thought that oral contraceptives could be helpful in preventing that loss or even helping regain lost bone mass. But now it's known that that's not the case. So making sure that you regain your period is also about making sure that you keep your skeletal system strong and healthy. There are also other benefits like, making sure that most people without a menstrual cycle lose their sex drive, and they have no lubrication, and they feel cold all of the time. And that's all because, even though we see no period, what's actually suppressed is your hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus suppression can have changes to other hormones like cortisol and your thyroid hormones, and the list goes on and on. So it's really an important sign of general overall health. And I've forgotten the second part of the question that you asked me.
Why may we lose the period?
So women can lose their period for a variety of reasons. If they have a history of disordered eating or an eating disorder, especially where restriction has been involved, or if they've lost a significant amount of weight, but are even still considered a quote unquote healthy weight, they can fall into hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is the classification of losing your period from either too much stress, underfueling your body, or over-exercising. So those are the three main reasons why it can happen for a female. And I've got a whole series on my podcast that basically looks at hypothalamic amenorrhea and the reasons why we might lose it. Another reason that women typically lose their period or it becomes irregular is polycystic ovarian syndrome. However, many, many, many women that have disordered eating or eating disorders are misdiagnosed with PCOS. And that is because if you have hypothalamic amenorrhea, they might do a scan on your ovaries and they might have the appearance of being polycystic, but without any of the other symptoms of PCOS. And that's where that misdiagnosis occurs. The reason why that's problematic is the treatment for PCOS is very, very different to the treatment for hypothalamic amenorrhea. So it's very important that you work with someone that knows the distinction between the two and how to properly diagnose them. Otherwise, you could end up making your condition worse instead of better.
Okay, wow. And is it possible to regain your period after you've lost it from an eating disorder?
100%. Yeah. So I lost mine for 10 years. So the length of time that you have lost your menstrual cycle is not a dictation of how long it'll take to get it back or whether you will. I think it's probably even more than recovering from my eating disorder. It's probably one of the most daunting things to go through by yourself. So again, make sure you get support for it. And in all honesty, it is very, very, very possible to get it back. It's just one of those processes you have to be patient with and kind and have faith in that it will happen.
Yeah. And do those, to get your period back, I know it's often the big question, like you do that much research. I know going through my eating disorders, like how do you get your period back? And it's always, I guess, the big answer and people looking for that quick fix that will just happen. But is it those, when you mention those 3 factors, do they all have to be aligned?
Yeah. So, and it's actually a lot more complicated than from the outside looking in. So essentially it is recorrecting the energy availability question. So if you have low energy availability from having an eating disorder, it's correcting that. And that is through increased nutrition and reducing the intensity and the volume of exercise that you're doing. The third one is managing psychological stress. Now, the reason why that can be complicated is sometimes people use exercise as a form of stress management, and even eating has been a form of stress management too. So restriction in that case. So it's really about going like in terms of energy intake. It's not just if you're eating enough calories. It is making sure that the person doesn't go for prolonged periods of time without eating, making sure they have enough carbs. There's actually a lot that you have to look at to make sure that the body is primed to kickstart that cycle back, which is why it's so important to work with a qualified health professional who has some really key interest in these areas so that they can give you correct advice.
Yeah. And when your period returns, is it straight away the perfect cycle, the 28 days and, full flow? Is that how it occurs?
Most of the time, no. It's kind of like going through a second puberty in a way, because your body is like, oh, we're going to do this again. And it's learning how to have a menstrual cycle again. So it's really important that in those first few cycles, you just take note of, number one, what you're doing with food and exercise and how your stress levels are. And number two, the spacing between your cycles. Sometimes it can be like 35 plus days before you get your next cycle. But the most important thing to note is that you start to get them more frequently as time progresses. So even if someone had hypothalamic amenorrhea in the past, it doesn't mean that they're going to be bulletproof against not getting it in the future. So like I said, think about your period as your report card. And if you are finding that maybe you start to get more normal cycles and then all of a sudden, you miss one, or one's a lot longer or takes a while to come, then go, have I increased my exercise a bit too much? Or am I really fueling my body enough as I need to? Or what is my sleep like? Or what is my stress like? And really make sure you tackle those factors to help your body get into that regular pattern again.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Now, before we head to sort of the end of the interview, I actually have a little segment for you, which is called Myth Busting. Cool. So I did do my research and also going through my recovery, I found a lot of statements and I guess ideas of people about what is an eating disorder. And I want your comments on it and a bit of a yes or a no, and then explain why. So my first one is people with an eating disorder should not exercise ever.
Oh, that's a myth. It's like saying people with an eating disorder should never brush their teeth. I think some form of movement is always positive. And just like you are rebuilding your relationship with food by challenging certain things and trying out new things, it's very important to do the same with exercise, sometimes in a very supported way. So with an exercise physiologist or a physiotherapist or someone that specializes in eating disorder recovery, so that they can be kind of that sounding board for you to get some perspective on what's okay and what's not okay, so that as you move through recovery and you become recovered, you have a better awareness of your body and what it needs and what's too much and what's okay.
That eating disorders you should fully recover from an eating disorder naturally, so no medication.
False.
Thoughts?
I think a lot of time medication is really, really helpful. And I think there's a lot of stigma around medication. There is nothing shameful about using medication to help yourself get over this condition. Like I said before, if someone had cancer or diabetes or something else and they needed medication, you'd be like, yeah, you take that. It's the same for this.
Yeah, awesome. You will never be fully recovered from your eating disorder.
I think that's a myth. I think
How do you know?
sometimes it's a good question. I think slowly it just becomes less a part of your life. And I think what people fail to recognize is that every single person has bad body image days. Everyone. When you're recovered from an eating disorder, you may still have some thoughts that pop up from time to time, but you've recovered, and your ability to actually recognize those thoughts and actually go, I don't need to act on those, is a really good indication that you are better.
Yeah, awesome. Anorexia is just a diet people go on to lose weight.
Oh, no, definitely false.
It's amazing how much I saw that actually looking online.
Yeah, I think sometimes, so anorexia nervosa, there's a strong epigenetic link, which means that people have a strand of DNA that can get switched on by environmental or behavioral factors. One of the biggest behavioral factors that switches on that gene is restriction. So sometimes people go on a diet, what they believe quite harmlessly, and then they fall into anorexia nervosa. But it is a mental health issue that has physical health complications and side effects, and one that has to be treated as such.
Yeah. Only young girls suffer from eating disorders.
People of any age, gender, background, socioeconomic status can suffer from an eating disorder. So they do not discriminate at all.
And it's actually quite surprising how many males as well now are suffering from eating disorders. Yeah.
A huge amount.
People with eating disorders choose to be sick.
No, not at all. I don't think anyone would ever rightly choose this illness or wish it on their worst enemy.
Yeah.
I think it's something that happens.
Yeah. Recovery only means sorry, I'll reframe that. Recovery only means eat as much as you can and do not move from the couch.
Recovery could mean that for one person, but it doesn't mean that it would look like that for everyone. I think recovery means creating a version of your life around food and exercise that feels sustainable, while in the short term might be very, very different from how you might live your life 5 years from now. But in general, it should be those habits that are quite sustainable.
Yeah. Eating disorders are an intention. I'm having a great one today. Eating disorders are an attention-seeking behavior.
No, not at all.
What makes you say that?
I think sometimes if people are going through a difficult time, they might do it initially to seek attention from a loved one. But I don't think that's often why an eating disorder is sustained or keeps going.
Awesome.
But again, I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah. Eating disorders are a normal behavior because everyone wants to lose weight and be thin.
I think disordered eating behaviors are very, very common. I don't think that makes them normal. I think society has normalized them. But I think that if you would, like, intermittent fasting, all of those things that have become popularized by the media are forms of also disordered eating in the wrong context.
It's not hard to recover from an eating disorder, just eat.
I think just eat is probably one of the most unhelpful statements that anyone could ever make.
Yeah. No.
No.
Yeah. And restricting your food intake is normal because diets tell us to restrict 24/7 a day.
Restriction, I mean, normal. How do you define normal? I think if anyone has an intention to lose weight, they should always do so under the care of a health professional and with educated advice and knowledge about what is appropriate for them. But you should never restrict just to feel starving all the time. And even people that aim to lose weight, if you do it in a sustainable way, you shouldn't feel hungry 24/7. That is not a healthy way to go about anything. But the whole point and how we should kind of view nutrition in a way is to prime our bodies to be able to eat as much as we can to thrive while maintaining our happiest weight.
Yeah. All right. And before we go off, I just want to ask, I'm going to give a few different age groups of people that may be suffering from an eating disorder and just give your best advice like you always do.
Okay.
So someone that is a very young person, a teenager that has parents that are looking after them, if they've just been diagnosed with an eating disorder, what advice would you give them?
I think the biggest thing is to know that you're not alone and that the people around you still really, really love you. As hard as it can be, trust your parents and trust your practicing, like your group of healthcare practitioners, that they know what is best for you. And even though it feels scary and even though that you don't want to sit down and eat that meal, you will thank yourself in 5 years' time when you're looking back and don't have any hang-ups around food that you just did it.
Yeah. What about a parent that is trying to support their young one who has been diagnosed with an eating disorder?
To the parent, you're their guiding light. And I know you're tired and probably just over all of the tantrums and things. But despite all of the backlash that you might get, the person underneath the eating disorder still really loves you. And if you keep persistent with all of the actions that you need to help your child get better, you will see that bright, shining, beautiful, vivacious soul come out again.
What about a young adult? So someone that may have just turned 18 or is now the independent person who is suffering from an eating disorder. What advice would you give them?
Stop partying and ignoring your problem. You don't know it all just yet, and go and get treatment. That was my age when I had my eating disorder, and I worked, I studied, and I spent my money on treatment, and it was the best money I ever spent. Even though everyone else was going out and partying, I look back now and I'm very, very proud that I invested in my own recovery.
Yeah. And what about someone stuck in quasi recovery?
I think that's that moment where you have to have that really, really honest self-reflection and go, am I really living my full life? Am I really living the big, beautiful, expansive life that I want to be? And if not, why not? And really tackle the food, maybe the social anxiety stuff, a whole bunch of the reasons why you aren't doing that.
Yeah. What about someone that is a parent themselves and find themselves restricting because they don't have time, it's a busy lifestyle, and eating disorder seems at the bottom of the list?
Yeah. So eating disorders can affect anyone of any age. I think if you are a parent that is struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder, just know that taking care of yourself is the best way to take care of the people around you, because children really absorb the behaviors and watch really closely what parents do, not necessarily what they say. So even though you might be really, really busy and you think you don't have time, just sit down on a Sunday and make a plan of how you can have easy meals throughout the week. Even 5 minutes to sit down and eat something is really, really important. It's not that people are too busy, it's that it's become a low priority. And as much as that sounds like BS, fueling your body is a high priority.
And my final one, what about a person, they haven't been diagnosed yet, but they're starting to develop common symptoms of restricting, looking at social media, the diet culture, wanting to be thin and lose weight? What advice would you give to them?
First of all, limit your time on social media. If you think about your interests in life, your social media feed should reflect those. So diversify your feed, follow funny things, follow your other interest areas, make time to read outside of being on your phone, and go seek assistance for the little niggly things so that they don't turn into bigger things. And also realize like going and seeing a psychologist can really help you deal with other things going on in your life that you didn't really think were an issue, and give you some great tools for how to cope in a really positive way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really appreciate your time today, Sarah. It has been phenomenal. I mean, we could talk about this issue for hours on end. It is something that we're both very passionate about, and I'm very thankful for you to come on.
Happy to.
Yes, thank you so much. And is there any resources? I know you did mention a lot of institutes throughout Australia and America that do support people. Do you want to just quickly run through a couple of them again, and even yourself?
Yes. So the ones that I mentioned before are the Butterfly Foundation, and they can be found online. The other ones are, like I said, the Inside Out Institute, and they're Inside Out. I think they're insideoutinstitute.org.au. I don't know. But you can Google them because they are in Sydney, and they have a whole bunch of resources on where you can find eating disorder practitioners. And then the other one, which is in America, is NEDA, which is the National Eating Disorders Association. So they're all really, really great places to go to find resources and information. The other one that is out of Western Australia that I just remembered is a Centre for Clinical Interventions. They're CCI online, and they have some self-help workbooks for people that may not be able to seek treatment immediately. And you can download all of those resources for free online.
That's awesome. That's so good. And what do you do to help people with eating disorders as well?
So I help people that are probably less clinically diagnosed, probably towards the end of their recovery, get into, first of all, I help them recover their period. That's a really big one. So I specialize in that hypothalamic amenorrhea recovery. And then I help people get over those last little food fears and hangups and start to kind of guide them through more an intuitive approach to eating once they have recovered their period and gotten over food fears, so they can really live a life where they have food freedom and they engage in exercise that's really, really joyful instead of it being like a should or a have to.
Yeah. No, awesome. Thank you so, so much for coming on today. And for anyone out there who's watching, if you're a parent or if you're a person suffering from an eating disorder, know that you are not alone and that there is hope. You're looking at two very hopeful people that have come through to the other side. So yes, just keep going, keep pushing through. We know it's hard. We know it's exhausting, but you can do it. We're all fighting with you. So again, thank you, Sarah, so, so much for coming on today and talking with us. Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. We got there in the end.
We did.
And have a lovely Sunday. Thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll see you all later. Thank you.